horror story. The crack in the glass was almost imperceptible, a hairline fracture spider-webbing from the top left corner, right where the frost never seemed to wholly retreat. It wasn't there when I arrived. It appeared after that night, after the persistent scratching had become a rhythmic, maddening thump, after the whispers started echoing not from the walls, but from deep within my own skull. I remembered the old keeper's warning, his eyes wide and hollow about the rule. I remembered dismissing it as a relic of isolation, a harmless eccentricity, but the crack, the subtle give in the reinforced steel of my resolve, proved him terrifyingly right. Have you ever felt a silence so profound that it wasn't peaceful, but instead predatory? My life before the lighthouse was a monotonous hum, a beige existence of cubicles and commuter traffic. I was 35, unattached and frankly bored, the kind of bored that gnaws at your soul, whispering about missed opportunities and the relentless march of time. I needed a seismic shift, a complete overhaul of my environment, something to jolt me awake. This is the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. If you want more stories like this, stories that will keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button right now. I post new horror accounts every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Go ahead, I'll wait. Subscribed. Good. Now, drop your city and the time where you're watching in the comments below. Let's see who's brave enough to listen in the dark. Now, turn off the lights if you dare. Ignore the noises your house makes in the silence, and let's find out together what truly hides in the darkness. My life for a good decade had been a series of predictable loops. Wake, commute, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The gears of my existence were well oiled, but the machine itself was producing nothing of value, merely consuming my time. I craved something drastic, something that would tear me from the comfortable, mind-numbing rut I'd inadvertently dug for myself. Therefore, when I stumbled upon the job advertisement, tucked away in an obscure online forum dedicated to remote work, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a premonition. Lighthouse keeper, Arctic Circle, 6-month contracts, exceptionally high pay. The pay was frankly ludicrous. It was enough to pay off my mortgage, clear my debts, and still have a substantial sum left over. Such remuneration usually came with immense risk or unbearable conditions. I suspected it was the latter, the isolation, the relentless cold, the eternal darkness of winter. But even those daunting prospects appealed to me. They were a clean break, a complete reset. I envisioned myself a sentinel against the vast, indifferent void, a romantic notion that felt grander than my current reality of Excel spreadsheets. The interview process was surprisingly brief, almost perfunctory. A video call with a jovial, balding man named Mr. Abernathy, who seemed more interested in my psychological resilience than my maritime experience, of which I had none. He chuckled when I admitted this, waving it off with a dismissive hand. Most of the work is automated now, son. We just need someone reliable, someone who can handle being truly alone, and someone who can follow instructions no matter how unusual they might seem. I was intrigued, but also a little unnerved by his emphasis on unusual. It was a fleeting thought, overshadowed by the promise of financial freedom and a dramatic change of scenery. Therefore, I accepted the offer without hesitation. The journey itself was a descent into an increasingly stark reality. Multiple flights, then a small bush plane that felt like it was stitched together with hope and duct tape, finally depositing me on a windswept, treeless expanse of rock and ice. The air bit at my exposed skin, colder than anything I'd ever experienced, feeling less like temperature and more like a physical pressure. It was an environment that demanded respect, a place where humanity was merely a tenuous, temporary visitor. A rugged, weathered man named Jarl met me, his face a roadmap of sun and wind exposure. He was the relief keeper, ready for his long-awaited return to civilization. He spoke little, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a habit I would soon find myself adopting. He pointed to the lighthouse, a colossal white pillar against the stark backdrop of an endless, frozen sea. It stood on a craggy outcrop, defiant and solitary, its lamp a beacon in the perpetual twilight that was the Arctic autumn. The sheer scale of it was humbling, a testament to human engineering against nature's raw power. But even from a distance I noticed something peculiar. The windows of the lantern room, where the light spun, seemed unusually thick, almost opaque. A specific heavy-duty type of glass, designed not just for strength against the elements, but almost as if for concealment. Inside, the lighthouse was surprisingly spacious, a spiral staircase winding upwards through multiple levels of living quarters and machinery. It was Spartan but functional, with a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a surprisingly well-stocked library that hinted at the previous keeper's attempts to stave off madness. Jarl gave me a quick tour, pointing out the essentials, the backup generators, the communication equipment. His instructions were concise, pragmatic, and delivered in a low, gravelly voice. Then we reached the lantern room, the very top, where the huge Fresnel lens spun silently, casting its rhythmic beam into the gathering gloom. He gestured vaguely at the expanse of thick, reinforced glass that formed the walls of the room, looking out over the desolate landscape. "One rule, lad," he said, turning to me, his voice dropping an octave, his eyes finally locking onto mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. His gaze was devoid of humor, replaced by something ancient and weary. "Only one, and it's paramount. You never, under any circumstances, look outside after dark." He paused, letting the words hang in the freezing air, heavy and absolute. Not even a quick glance. "Keep the blinds drawn tight. And during the day," he added, his voice softening only slightly, "you look out only when absolutely necessary, to check the weather or for ice flows. You don't linger, you don't stare. Understand?" I confess I almost laughed. It sounded utterly ridiculous, like something out of a child's spooky story. An arbitrary rule, a relic of superstitious sailors, perhaps a way to break the monotony for the lonely keeper. "Why?" I asked, a faint smile playing on my lips. He didn't return it. His expression remained grim. "It's not for you to understand, lad. It's for you to obey. Lives depend on it. Yours most of all." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer a fantastical explanation of sea monsters or vengeful spirits. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling certainty. This lack of a sensational story made it even more unsettling. It suggested a truth so self-evident to him, it didn't require embellishment. Therefore, despite my skepticism, a sliver of unease began to insinuate itself. The sheer solemnity in his voice, the way his eyes held a distant, haunted quality, prevented me from dismissing it entirely. But still, I was pragmatic. Arctic darkness, extreme cold, perhaps optical illusions, or the danger of eye strain. It had to be something practical, something rational. The mind, truly isolated, could play tricks, of course. Perhaps they wanted to prevent hallucinations, a common hazard of prolonged solitude. That was the logical explanation I clung to. The vast expanse of ocean and ice, the endless dark, could certainly warp perception. Jarl left a few hours later, a roar of a snowmobile fading into the vast, oppressive quiet. And then I was alone, truly alone. The silence that descended after he left was unlike any I had ever experienced. It wasn't merely the absence of sound. It felt like a presence, a heavy blanket that absorbed every faint noise I made, every breath. It was a vacuum pressing in from all sides. The light continued its slow, deliberate sweep, but it felt less like a comfort and more like a solitary, defiant heartbeat against the encroaching void. My initial days were spent settling in, learning the automated systems and establishing a routine. The rule, I found, was easy enough to follow. The thick, insulated blinds for the lantern room windows were heavy and effective, plunging the room into total darkness when drawn. During the day, I would occasionally pull them back briefly to check the weather, observe the unbroken expanse of ice fields stretching to the horizon. It was a desolate beauty, a landscape of stark whites and grays, utterly devoid of any noticeable life. But even those brief glances I noticed began to feel uncomfortable. Not dangerous, not exactly, but the sheer emptiness of it, the colossal scale, began to press in on me, creating a sense of insignificance that was almost crushing. I often found myself quickly drawing the blinds back, preferring the enclosed comfort of the lantern room, the hum of machinery, to the silent, watchful world outside. My rational mind tried to contextualize this feeling. It was sensory deprivation, I told myself. The human brain craves input, and here there was virtually none beyond the inside of the lighthouse. Naturally, one would become sensitive to the starkness of the outside world. This was just the early stages of adjusting to extreme isolation. Perhaps Jarl's rule was merely a psychological tool, a way to focus the mind inward, to prevent the outside from completely overwhelming the senses. Subtle test, perhaps, of my capacity for self-discipline rather than a genuine warning, but the memory of Jarl's eyes, wide and hollow, still lingered. Therefore, I tried my best to adhere to the instruction, even when the rational part of me dismissed it as an old wives' tale or a prank played on the new guy. The pay was worth it, I reasoned. The solitude was what I'd signed up for. But as the perpetual twilight of autumn gave way to the deeper, almost impenetrable darkness of the Arctic winter, and the days became mere hours of dim light, the oppressive silence outside began to feel less like a vacuum and more like a waiting. I would be reading one of the worn books from the library or making myself a simple meal, and a sudden, inexplicable shiver would run down my spine. I would glance up, expecting to see something, hear something, but there was never anything. Just the steady hum of the lighthouse, the rhythmic sweep of the beam. It was the feeling of being watched, an impossible sensation in a place so utterly devoid of life, but it was there, a persistent pinprick at the back of my neck. And this feeling intensified with each passing day, transforming the profound silence from something merely desolate into something subtly menacing. The initial weeks had been a peculiar blend of novelty and grinding routine. I'd established a rhythm, checking the automated systems, logging weather data, preparing meals, and reading. The books in Jarl's makeshift library became my only companions, offering glimpses into other worlds, other lives, a stark contrast to my own increasingly hermetic existence. The silence, initially overwhelming, had begun to normalize, becoming the new backdrop to my thoughts, but it was a fragile piece, easily disturbed. It started subtly, a creak from the metal structural beams that felt too deliberate to be mere expansion or contraction in the extreme cold. A soft thud from a floor above, or perhaps just below, when I was certain I was the only soul within hundreds of miles. My first instinct was always rationalization. The vast structure of the lighthouse settling, ice shifts against the foundations, the wind playing tricks. The Arctic wind, I quickly learned, was a master illusionist, capable of conjuring phantom voices and ghostly footsteps from thin air alone. It howled and shrieked with a primal intensity, a constant mournful wail that was often indistinguishable from the sound of a human cry or something worse. Therefore, I'd initially dismissed these auditory anomalies. I told myself it was the expected consequence of extreme isolation, the mind searching for patterns, for company, in the absence of genuine stimuli. I'd even started talking to myself, a habit I tried to suppress, but which grew more frequent with each passing day. It was a coping mechanism, a way to fill the void, to ensure my own voice still existed against the backdrop of the world's profound silence. Yet the sounds persisted and began to acquire a peculiar consistency. The thud, for instance, wasn't random. It seemed to come from the very top, the lantern room, specifically from the floor directly above my living quarters. It wasn't loud enough to be a maintenance hatch slamming or a heavy object falling. It was softer, more like something shifting, or perhaps a gentle, deliberate bump. One evening, while reading by the weak glow of a single lamp, a distinct scratching sound echoed from the wall next to me. It wasn't the skittering of a rodent. I was meticulous about cleanliness, and the lighthouse was sealed tight against the elements. This was a slow, deliberate scrape, like rough fabric or a stiff bristle brush being dragged across the metal. I froze, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. I held my breath, straining my ears, but it ceased as quickly as it began. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, perhaps a loose cable vibrating against the outer shell of the lighthouse. But the wind, though constant, had not changed in intensity, and the sound had been inside, resonant within the very structure. My sleep patterns, initially undisturbed, began to fray. I found myself waking abruptly in the dead of the perpetual night, not from a nightmare, but from a sudden, oppressive sensation, as if a great weight had been placed upon the air itself. The silence in those moments was not merely the absence of sound, but an active, suffocating presence, a pressure that felt almost physical. I'd lie there, listening, my heart thumping against my ribs, convinced I was about to hear something, see something. But there was never anything, just the cold, the dark, and the relentless, rhythmic sweep of the light. The ground detail I focused on was the ice. I made a habit of observing ice formations through the small, reinforced porthole in my living quarters during the brief daylight hours. The way it formed, the intricate patterns, the enormous flows that drifted slowly past, it was a tangible, scientific distraction. I learned about brash ice, pancake ice, and the formidable multi-year ice. It reminded me of the scientific beauty of the Arctic, a counterpoint to the growing irrationality I felt creeping into my perceptions. But even these observations started to feel less like a hobby and more like a desperate anchor to reality. The very vastness of the frozen landscape, unbroken and unforgiving, seemed to mock my attempts at control. The foreshowing detail came in the form of the shadows. The light from the lantern room, when viewed from inside the living quarters below, cast enormous, distorted shadows through the stairwell and hallways. They danced and stretched, elongating into monstrous shapes with every rotation of the Fresnel lens. At first, it was harmless, an aesthetic quirk of the lighthouse's design. But as my anxiety mounted, these shadows began to take on a life of their own. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, just beyond the reach of the lamp, only for them to vanish when I turned my head directly. A fleeting silhouette that seemed too tall, too gaunt, to be a trick of light. My mind, of course, presented a logical explanation: pareidolia, the tendency for the brain to find patterns in random stimuli. It was a common phenomenon, exacerbated by isolation and lack of human contact. The human brain is hardwired to detect faces, figures, threats. In this desolate environment, it was simply overcompensating, projecting fears onto harmless shadows. Therefore, I tried to dismiss them, to consciously break the patterns my mind was forming. But the shadows persisted, growing more defined, more insistent. The element of ambiguity that truly started to unravel me was the sense of smell. One evening, after a particularly unsettling series of soft thuds from the lantern room, a faint, almost imperceptible odor drifted through the vent from the upper levels. It wasn't the sterile smell of metal or ozone from the machinery. It was earthy, damp, and vaguely organic, like wet soil mixed with something mineral, almost like brine. It was the smell of the outside, but concentrated, somehow wrong. I walked through the small living space, sniffing, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. It was a ghost of a smell, appearing and disappearing, leaving me questioning if I had imagined it entirely. My logical brain screamed condensation, trapped air, forgotten debris, but my gut recoiled. The clarity test, what was happening? Strange, unidentifiable sounds and smells were infiltrating my isolated existence. Why was it important? These phenomena were eroding my sense of security and challenging my rational explanations for the world. What was at stake? My sanity and my ability to cope with the extreme isolation. The weight of this mounting unease began to press upon the rule Jarl had so emphatically laid out: never look outside after dark. During the day, my brief checks of the weather were increasingly punctuated by a lingering gaze, a frantic scanning of the featureless white expanse. I was searching for something, anything, a polar bear, a seal, a distant icebreaker, to reaffirm that the world outside was just that, a world filled with natural, explainable things. But there was never anything. Just the endless, indifferent tundra and ocean stretching out beneath a sky that seemed perpetually bruised. One evening, the wind reached a fever pitch, screaming around the lighthouse with a ferocity that rattled the very foundations. The entire structure vibrated, a low, resonant thrumming that resonated in my chest. And then, above the cacophony of the storm, I heard it again, a distinct, rhythmic tap, 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 against the very glass of the lantern room windows. It wasn't the wind-driven ice granules which made a harsher, more scattered sound. This was softer, more deliberate, almost gentle. It reminded me of a fingernail tapping against glass. But what could be tapping? There was nothing out there, absolutely nothing that could reach the top of the lighthouse, that high up in a blizzard. My heart hammered. I wanted desperately to pull back the blinds just for a second to see what impossible thing was making that sound. The temptation was a physical ache, a burning curiosity that gnawed at me. I gripped the cold metal railing of the internal stairwell, my knuckles white, breathing shallowly. The intensity of the tapping increased, becoming slightly more frantic, a soft yet insistent demand against the thick glass. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to look, to find a rational explanation, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But Jarl's grim face, his hollow eyes, flashed in my memory. His words resonated with a new, terrifying weight. Lives depend on it. Yours most of all. The tapping continued, a relentless assault on my composure, a test of my willpower, making the silence that followed each series of taps even more unbearable. It was an invitation, a veiled threat, beckoning from the impenetrable darkness. The absolute certainty of nothing being out there, yet the undeniable sound, forced a profound shift in my perception. The solitude I had sought began to feel less like freedom and more like imprisonment. The rhythmic tapping on the lantern room glass, coupled with the relentless wind, stretched my nerves to breaking point. I spent that entire night huddled in my living quarters, away from the top, trying to drown out the sound with the drone of the old radio Jarl had left behind, picking up only static and the occasional distorted murmur of a distant foreign broadcast. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the lighthouse, every gust of wind seemed amplified, imbued with malevolent intent. By morning, when the brief, hazy twilight finally filtered through the portholes, revealing only a world of swirling snow and bruised sky, the tapping had ceased. The silence that replaced it was not a relief, but a tense, watchful quiet, as if whatever had been there was merely waiting. The psychological toll was immediate and profound. My carefully constructed edifice of rationality began to crumble. The ambiguity of the sounds, the fleeting shadows, the inexplicable smell, they all coalesced into a gnawing doubt. Was I truly alone? Or was the isolation itself the weapon designed to soften my mind, to make me susceptible to suggestion, hallucination, or something far worse? I started to question every sensation, every thought. A new kind of fear took root, not of a monster in the dark, but of the monster within my own mind. This was the true psychological horror. I tried to regain control through ritual. I meticulously cleaned the entire lighthouse, from top to bottom, scrubbing surfaces, checking every bolt and connection. It was a grounding detail, a physical act of imposing order on a world that felt increasingly chaotic. I wanted to find a loose panel, a hidden vent, any mundane explanation for the strange phenomena, but I found nothing. The lighthouse was a fortress sealed tight, built to withstand the harshest conditions on Earth. Therefore, the absence of any rational cause only deepened the mystery, adding another layer to my already stretched nerves. My routine of checking the exterior during the day became less about duty and more about obsession. I would pull back the heavy blinds in the lantern room, my heart pounding, and scan the horizon with the powerful binoculars, searching for anything at all. A distant rock formation that looked like a figure, an unusual ice flow, a glint of metal. But the view was always the same, an interminable expanse of white and gray, occasionally broken by the dark, churning waters where the ice had not yet fully formed. The scale of the desolation was overwhelming, creating a sense of insignificance that was almost crushing. It was a world that seemed to actively reject life, which only made the idea of a persistent, unseen presence even more terrifying. The element of ambiguity escalated when I started noticing things inside the lighthouse, small objects slightly out of place. My mug, left on the kitchen counter, would sometimes be found a few inches to the left or rotated a different way. A bookmark in one of Jarl's books would be in a different page than I remembered. These were tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, easily dismissed as my own forgetfulness or inattention. But they happened often enough, and with enough consistency, that I began to log them mentally, then on a scrap of paper, creating a chilling inventory of subtle disturbances. It was never anything valuable, nothing stolen or broken. It was always a rearrangement, a quiet, almost playful declaration of presence. The clarity test, what was happening, subtle, unexplainable shifts of objects within the lighthouse coupled with a deepening psychological impact. Why was it important? These shifts challenged my perception of being alone and contributed to a growing paranoia, blurring the lines between reality and delusion. What was at stake? My sanity, my ability to trust my own senses, and the very foundation of my isolated existence. The foreshadowing detail wasn't something I saw, but rather something I felt, a growing cold spot in the lantern room. It wasn't the ambient cold of the Arctic, which seeped into everything despite the heating. This was a localized, unnatural chill, sometimes concentrated around the windows, sometimes near the center of the room. It migrated. I'd feel it as a sudden icy breath on my neck, or a wave of profound cold washing over my hands as I walked past a certain area. I checked the heating vents, the insulation, but everything was in perfect working order. The chill was an anomaly, a persistent, unsettling pocket of defiance against the warmth of the lighthouse's core. It felt like something belonged in that cold, something that thrived in it and was now encroaching. The paranoia became a physical burden. I started carrying a heavy wrench with me when I moved between levels, a pathetic attempt at self-defense against an unseen, undefined threat. I found myself checking behind doors, under bunks, peering into every shadowy corner, knowing full well there was nowhere for anyone or anything to hide. The silence, which had once been profound, now felt loaded. Every quiet moment was pregnant with unspoken possibility, every whisper of the wind a potential message. I began to speak less, even to myself, conserving my words as if speaking might draw attention, might confirm that I was indeed here, alone, a tempting focus for whatever lurked just beyond comprehension. The most terrifying aspect was the erosion of my perception of time. Days blurred into nights, the perpetual twilight of the Arctic winter obscuring the natural rhythm of the world. My internal clock went haywire. I'd often find myself waking up from a doze, convinced it was a different time than it was, a different day. It was a disorienting, unsettling experience, contributing to the feeling of losing my grip on reality. The isolation was a crucible, burning away everything I thought I knew about myself, about the world. Then came the dreams, vivid, unsettling nightmares that felt less like dreams and more like memories of events that hadn't happened. I would see myself, standing at the lantern room window, staring out into an endless, shifting blackness. And in that blackness, something would solidify, something immense and utterly alien, its form glimpsed only fleetingly, evoking a primal terror that lingered long after I woke. The details were always indistinct, always just beyond the cusp of recognition, but the feeling of utter dread was profoundly real. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. The image burned into my mind, and the memory of Jarl's rule would resound with a new, terrifying urgency. Therefore, the rule which I had once ridiculed now became a desperate anchor. It was the one concrete instruction, the one line I dared not cross, for fear of what it might confirm. My rational mind still searched for explanations, for scientific reasoning. Perhaps the intense cold caused specific atmospheric refraction that could induce profound optical illusions, causing the brain to misinterpret patterns as something monstrous. Or maybe the persistent, low-frequency sounds of the ocean and ice below the range of human hearing were subtly impacting my brain chemistry, leading to sensory distortions. This was the ambiguity I had to live with, the constant battle between what my senses screamed and what my reason tried to salvage. But the tapping returned, not on the glass this time, but on the metal exterior of the lighthouse, lower down, closer to my living quarters. It was a scraping sound now, slow and ponderous, like something large and heavy being dragged across the steel plates. It moved. I could track its progress, moving around the circumference of the lighthouse, slowly, deliberately. The sound was impossible. There was no way for anything to be clinging to the sheer, icy walls that far down, in the middle of a blizzard. The cold, the wind, the treacherous footing, it defied all logic and physics. Yet there it was, an undeniable, horrifying reality. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed myself against the interior wall, listening to the impossible dragging sound, the slow, agonizing scrape of something. The scraping stopped directly outside my porthole. I could hear it clear as day, a heavy scraping sound followed by a soft, almost wet thump. It was directly outside, on the other side of that thick, reinforced glass. My mind screamed at me to look, to confirm, but a deeper, more primal instinct, born from Jarl's grim warning and the accumulated terror of the past weeks, held me paralyzed. I could feel its presence, a cold, heavy weight pressing against the other side of the glass, only inches away. It was an unbearable proximity, a violation of the safe sanctuary I had tried to build. The only thing separating me from it was the reinforced glass and my unwavering adherence to the rule. The stakes had never been higher. The scraping and the soft, wet thump outside my porthole had solidified an unimaginable horror. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. Something was there. I spent what felt like an eternity pressed against the opposite wall of my living quarters, heart hammering against my ribs, every muscle tensed, listening to the suffocating silence that followed the sound. I could feel its gaze, a palpable weight on the reinforced glass, an entity patiently waiting, knowing I was inside. The cold spot I had felt in the lantern room now seemed to permeate the entire lighthouse, chilling me to the bone, not just from the Arctic air, but from an internal source of dread. Therefore the rule, initially a mere eccentricity, had transformed into an absolute imperative, a thin shield against an incomprehensible threat. My rational mind, though severely fractured, clung to it with desperate tenacity. I knew with a terrifying certainty that to look would be to invite something far worse than just seeing. It would be an acknowledgement, an invitation, a breaking of a sacred pact that was somehow keeping whatever was outside. The clarity test was failing me. I knew what was happening. Something was outside. Why it was important, my safety, and what was at stake, my life, my sanity, but I had no explanation for how or what. This vacuum of understanding was the true terror. The ensuing days and nights became a blur of hypervigilance and crushing psychological pressure. The sounds didn't stop. They changed. The dragging, scraping noises returned, sometimes moving across the roof of the lantern room, sometimes lower down, circling the base of the lighthouse, always just out of sight, always when the blinds were drawn or the darkness was absolute. It was a relentless psychological siege. Sometimes the sounds were accompanied by a faint clicking noise, like chitinous limbs scuttling across metal, or perhaps something even more alien. This was a new, disturbing detail, suggesting not just heavy dragging, but also precise, agile movement. My sleep became almost non-existent. The dreams, when they came, were more vivid, more terrifying. I would be standing in a vast, echoing space, not the lighthouse, but something impossibly larger, colder, and in the distance, a looming form, always just beyond the edges of my peripheral vision, always shifting, always there. I'd wake up gasping, bathed in cold sweat, the lingering dread clinging to me like a shroud. The lasting consequences of this relentless psychological torture were manifesting in physical ways. Tremors in my hands, a constant ache behind my eyes, and a pervasive bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could alleviate. One evening, after several days of relentless wind and the intermittent, maddening sounds, the communication system died. The satellite phone went dead. The emergency radio broadcast nothing but static, a grounding detail. The Arctic environment is notoriously harsh on electronics. I tried to repair it, tracing the lines, checking the power supply, anything I could think of, but it was completely unresponsive. The only link to the outside world, to humanity, was severed. I was truly, irrevocably alone. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a deliberate act, cutting me off, isolating me further. The element of ambiguity now enveloped my entire existence. I started to wonder if I had ever truly been hired for this job, or if I had simply walked into a meticulously crafted trap. The easy interview, the disproportionate pay, Jarl's cryptic warning, they all seemed to fit a new, terrifying narrative. Was this lighthouse a prison, a testing ground, or something far more sinister, a place where things were deliberately contained, and I was merely the latest, unwitting keeper? My mind reeled with these possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. The line between reality and delusion was now completely blurred. The foreshadowing detail that now hung like a pall over my perception was the unusual thickness of the lantern room glass. I revisited Jarl's initial tour in my mind, the way he gestured vaguely at the windows, and my own observation of their opaque quality. It wasn't just for insulation or strength against storms. It was a barrier, a deliberate obscuring, designed to prevent something from being seen, or perhaps to prevent something from seeing in too clearly. It wasn't a window. It was a lens, a filter, meant to protect me from the truth. The presence outside had grown bolder. It wasn't just sounds anymore. On a particular evening, a profound vibration began to resonate through the entire lighthouse, a deep, guttural thrumming that seemed to shake the very rock foundation upon which the structure stood. It was immense, powerful, and seemed to emanate from directly beneath the lighthouse. The Fresnel lens, usually silent during its rotation, began to make a subtle, grinding noise, as if it were struggling against some unseen resistance. The entire structure felt like it was groaning, bending against an incomprehensible force. My teeth rattled in my skull. I clutched the heavy wrench, my only comfort, as if it could somehow protect me against a force of this magnitude. Then the lights flickered. The powerful lantern, the very heart of the lighthouse, sputtered, dimmed, and then surged back to full power, only to dim again. It was struggling. Something was interfering with the power supply, something immense and unnatural. The emergency generators kicked in with a clatter, but even they seemed to labor, their hum strained. The rhythmic beam, my only visual connection to the outside world, started to falter, casting erratic, broken arcs into the encroaching blackness. This was a direct assault, a deliberate attempt to extinguish the light, to plunge the lighthouse into total darkness. Before we continue, I need to tell you something. What happens next in this story, it changed everything. But here's the thing. If you're not subscribed, you're going to miss the follow-up I'm posting next week. Yes, there's more to this. And it's worse, so do yourself a favor, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because when I post the next part, you'll want to know immediately. Trust me on this. Now, back to the nightmare. I scrambled up the winding staircase to the lantern room, driven by a desperate primal instinct to keep the light burning. The grinding noise from the lens was louder now, a metallic shriek that grated on my nerves. The air in the lantern room was impossibly cold, the localized chill, now a pervasive, suffocating presence that stole my breath. I could see my own breath fogging in the frigid air, despite the efforts of the heating system. The entire room felt like a freezer, a direct contrast to the warmth of my quarters below. The thick blinds, which I had drawn so carefully, were straining, bulging inwards slightly, as if something was pressing against them, a dark, heavy weight on the other side. Panic began to set in, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I approached the control panel, my hands shaking so violently I could barely press the buttons. The diagnostic readings were flashing red, incomprehensible error codes scrolling across the screen. The light was failing, and then a sound I had never heard before, a wet, guttural slithering that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the lantern room. It was like something impossibly vast, impossibly heavy, was moving outside, directly against the outer hull of the light room, scale against metal, tearing at the very fabric of the structure. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, a sickening, undulating pressure, and with that slithering, a new smell permeated the air, something far more potent than the faint, earthy scent from before. It was a sickly sweet, metallic odor, like blood and stagnant seawater, mixed with something utterly alien and profoundly repulsive. It was overwhelming, forcing me to gag, to turn my head away. This was not condensation or trapped air. This was the stench of something alive, something immense, something wrong. It was assaulting my senses from all directions, an undeniable confirmation that what was outside was not merely abstract, but physical, monstrous. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness, only for the emergency lights to kick in, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the slithering sound. I was trapped in a failing light, besieged by an unseen horror, with my only link to sanity, the communication system, dead. The rule, never look outside, was the only thing I had left. But the pressure, the sheer overwhelming assault on my senses, was almost too much to bear. I felt a primal urge, a desperate, maddening curiosity to know what impossible thing could be making these sounds, generating this cold, carrying this stench. The thick glass which had been a shield now felt like a taunting veil. It was an unbearable torture, this proximity to the unknown, this deliberate denial of sight. I could feel its gaze through the opaque glass, knowing it knew I was there, alive, breathing, and terrified. The stench of brine and something unholy filled the lantern room, a visceral assault that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the primal core of my being. The slithering, the guttural thrumming, the straining blinds. It was no longer a question of if something was out there, but what. And whatever it was immense, powerful, and very, very close. My rational mind had completely disintegrated, replaced by sheer, animalistic terror. The fortress of the lighthouse, my sanctuary, was now a cage under siege. I pressed myself against the central pillar of the lantern room, away from the windows, trying to make myself as small, as invisible as possible. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhale a struggle against the overwhelming stench. The light, my only defense, sputtered again, casting the room into near darkness for a terrifying few seconds before the emergency system kicked in with a strained groan. The rhythmic sweep became ragged, hesitant, casting broken arcs into the suffocating blackness outside. It was a dying heartbeat, losing its rhythm, losing its strength. The sounds outside escalated into a desperate, furious frenzy. The slithering became a frantic, tearing noise, as if whatever was out there was trying to rip the very metal plates from the lighthouse's exterior. There were loud, resonant thumps against the glass, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by a sickening squelching sound, a horrifying confirmation of raw, organic pressure. The whole lantern room shook, vibrating violently, and I could hear the faint, high-pitched screech of metal under unbearable stress. I legitimately thought the glass, thick as it was, might shatter. My mind, stripped of all reason, presented a chilling vision, a foreshadowing detail that felt less like an imagined horror and more like an imminent reality. The crack I had seen in my cold open. It flashed before my eyes, a hairline fracture spiderwebbing from the top left corner. I had seen it in the future, a proof of this moment, of the immense pressure the glass was under. It wasn't just a crack. It was a scar, a testament to what was hammering on the other side. This moment, this unbearable pressure was the cause. It was a terrifying premonition within the present horror, the element of ambiguity now centered on my own willpower. Could I truly maintain the rule, or would the pressure break me? Every fiber of my being screamed for a rational explanation, for visual confirmation, however horrifying. The human mind, wired for understanding, rebels against the unknown. This was a deliberate, calculated torture, designed to exploit that innate human need. The fear of seeing something was almost outweighed by the unbearable torment of not knowing. The grounding detail that momentarily pulled me back from the brink of hysteria was the precise engineering of the lighthouse itself. I remembered reading parts of the technical manual Jarl had left behind: the reinforced steel, the triple-paned, pressure-resistant glass, the sheer structural integrity designed to withstand Arctic storms, ice shifts, even minor seismic events. This place was a fortress. If it was struggling, if it was groaning, then whatever was outside was of an entirely different order of magnitude than anything remotely natural. This was physical proof that my senses weren't entirely deceiving me. It was a terrifying validation. Then the thumping intensified, becoming a monstrous rhythmic slam, slam, slam against the glass, centered directly on one of the lantern room panes. It was a deliberate, focused assault. The glass bowed inwards, a visible, terrifying distortion. I could hear a low groan from the glass itself, a deep frequency that vibrated through my bones. A hairline fracture, shimmering faintly, appeared in the top left corner of the pane under attack. It spiderwebbed slowly, deliberately, a testament to the colossal force being exerted on the other side. My heart leaped into my throat. The crack. It was happening. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it wanted me to look. This relentless assault wasn't just about breaking the lighthouse. It was about breaking me. It was a psychological game, and it was winning. The curiosity, once a distant temptation, now became an overwhelming, agonizing urge. My eyes were drawn to that cracking pain. Despite every instinct, every warning, I felt an irresistible pull, a hypnotic draw to the growing fissures, to the blackness beyond. My hand, as if acting on its own accord, reached out, trembling, for the thick steel lever that operated the blinds for that specific pane. Jarl's words, "Never look outside after dark," screamed in my mind, fighting against the powerful, almost magnetic pull of the unknown. But the pressure, the thumping, the crack growing longer, wider, it was too much. The sheer psychological torture of being so close, of having the answer literally inches away, was unbearable. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All that mattered was knowing. With a terrible, agonizing slowness, I pulled the lever. The heavy blind, designed to seal out the brutal Arctic night, began to retract, groaning against the strain. My eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on the opening slit, on the sliver of blackness that was revealing itself. The thumping stopped abruptly the moment the blind began to move. An unnatural silence descended. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was a waiting silence, heavy and suffocating, amplifying the frantic thump of my own heart in my ears. The blind slid back, revealing the full expanse of the thick, fractured glass, and there, pressed flat against the outside of the pane, was an eye. Not a human eye, nothing remotely human. It was immense, easily larger than my head, and utterly, impossibly black. It had no iris, no pupil, just an abyssal void that seemed to drink in the scant light from the dying lamp. The skin around it was a slick, dark gray, pitted and textured like ancient, water-worn stone. But the most horrifying detail was the network of tiny, pulsing veins that spiderwebbed across its surface, a sickly greenish luminescence within their depths. It was ancient, alien, and possessed of a profound, terrible intelligence that radiated from its unblinking stare. It filled my entire field of vision for that pane, pressed so close it distended the thick glass, creating a grotesque, convex distortion of its surface. There was no eyelid, no blink. Just that perfect, fathomless blackness staring directly into my soul. I could feel its gaze, not just on my eyes, but burrowing deep into my mind, a probing, cold awareness. It saw me. It knew me. And in that terrifying moment, I knew with crystalline clarity that it was not merely an inhabitant of the Arctic, but something that defied all natural laws, something that belonged to a deeper, more profound darkness. The metallic, sickly sweet stench intensified to an unbearable degree, and a faint, almost imperceptible low hum resonated from the eye itself, a vibration that went straight into my skull. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but one I felt, a deep, resonant frequency that threatened to shake my very consciousness apart. It was a communication, a silent, terrifying message of pure, unadulterated malevolence. It was ancient, patient, and now it had seen me. The rule was broken. The barrier, psychological and physical, was breached, and I knew, with a certainty that froze my blood, that my transgression had unforgivable consequences. The single abyssal eye pressed against the fracturing glass consumed my entire world. It wasn't merely looking at me, it was seeing through me, into the deepest, most primal parts of my being. The pervasive low hum it emitted resonated within my skull, a silent scream of pure, cold intelligence. In that instant, every fear, every doubt, every unsettling sound, every shifting shadow of the past weeks coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. Jarl's rule was not a superstition. It was a desperate plea for self-preservation, a shield against precisely this moment. My body reacted before my mind could process the full terror. A primal, instinctual panic seized me. I stumbled backward, pulling the lever frantically, slamming the heavy blind shut with a desperate, guttural cry. The mechanical groan of the blind was deafening in the sudden, echoing silence that followed. The moment the blind covered the fractured pane, the suffocating presence seemed to recede. The impossibly cold air in the lantern room seemed to lift, ever so slightly. But the image of that eye, that fathomless blackness, was burned into my retinas, seared onto my soul. I scrambled down the spiral staircase, tripping, tumbling, barely catching myself on the cold metal railings. My legs felt like jelly, my lungs burned from the frantic gasping. I didn't stop until I reached my living quarters, slamming the heavy reinforced door shut and throwing every lock, every deadbolt, every latch, as if flimsy metal could hold back what I had just seen. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably, retching, but nothing came up. My entire being was consumed by a terror so absolute it left no room for anything else. The lasting consequences of that moment were immediate and debilitating. I became a prisoner within my own sanctuary. The sounds outside continued, though they seemed to diminish in intensity, as if whatever had been there was now content, having achieved its objective. The slithering, the scraping, the occasional distant thumps, they were still there, but subtly different, less aggressive, more watchful. It was no longer a siege, but a patient vigil. It knew I was there. It knew I had seen. My world shrank to the narrow confines of my living quarters. I barely ate, barely slept. The dreams became ceaseless, vivid replays of that single, unblinking eye, sometimes multiplied, sometimes morphing into other, equally monstrous forms that were always just beyond recognition. I would wake up screaming, or in absolute silent horror, unable to distinguish dream from waking nightmare. My mind was a broken kaleidoscope, fractured into 1,000 shards of terror and paranoia. The communication system remained dead, a cruel irony. My only link to help, to proof of other human existence, was gone. But even if it had worked, what would I have said? There's an enormous, unblinking eye staring at me from the Arctic darkness. They would have assumed isolation-induced psychosis, confined me, dismissed my terror as delusion. And in my heart, a sliver of me wondered if they would be right. Had I truly seen it, or had my mind, pushed to the absolute breaking point, finally manufactured the thing it most feared? This was the true haunting, the element of ambiguity that would follow me forever. For days I remained in my living quarters, venturing out only to ensure the automated systems were still functioning, occasionally checking the lantern room from the doorway, never drawing the blinds, never looking at the cracked pane. The light itself, the powerful beacon, continued its broken, faltering sweep. It was a lifeline, a desperate hope, but also a constant reminder of my transgression, of the fragile barrier I had broken between myself and the terrifying unknown. My escape was haphazard, fueled by a resurgence of desperate self-preservation. One day, during a brief, merciful lull in the ceaseless wind, I heard the faint, distant roar of an engine. Another bush plane, perhaps. My relief keeper coming to relieve me weeks early, or perhaps sent to check on the downed communications. Whatever the reason, it was my one chance. With trembling hands, I gathered what few belongings I could, barely noticing the heavy wrench I still clutched. My focus was singular: get out. I did not look back at the lighthouse as I departed on the small plane, leaving Jarl's replacement standing at its base, his face a mixture of concern and confusion at my disheveled, wild-eyed appearance. I could feel the lighthouse's gaze, a cold, knowing pressure on my back, even from thousands of feet in the air. The vast, desolate landscape seemed to stretch forever, concealing a horrifying secret, a truth my mind could barely comprehend. I never spoke of what I saw, not to the medical personnel who examined me for signs of frostbite and malnutrition, not to the company representative who asked about the damaged equipment and my sudden return. I blamed the isolation, the extreme cold, the pressure of the job, fabricating a convenient narrative of mental strain. They accepted it. They had seen it before, they said, keepers who couldn't handle the Arctic solitude. They paid me generously for my shortened contract, eager to dismiss the whole incident. But the silence I had sought, the escape from the monotonous hum of my old life, was replaced by a different kind of noise. Constant low hum that echoes in the deepest recesses of my mind, a phantom vibration that I instinctively associate with that immense black eye. I still feel the cold spots, even in the warmth of my new apartment, a sudden, inexplicable chill that washes over me, leaving goosebumps on my skin. And the dreams persist, not always of the eye itself, but of the vast, lightless expanse that contained it, and the knowing, patient intelligence that lurked within. This is the truth I lived. The world outside the lighthouse, the one I had glimpsed for a terrifying moment, is still out there, and it remembers me. It has been years since I left the lighthouse. The financial security I gained was supposed to bring peace, a return to normalcy. But normalcy is a luxury I can no longer afford. Every shadow dancing at the periphery of my vision holds a potential threat. Every sudden noise sends a jolt of icy fear through me. The world, once a place of predictable routines, now feels thin, a mere veil over something vast and indifferent, something that occasionally brushes against the edges of our reality. I find myself constantly scanning the horizon, even in a bustling city, looking for an impossible shape, a subtle shift in the light that would betray its presence. The rule, never look outside, echoes in my mind not as a warning I failed to heed, but as a profound, terrible truth. There are things beyond our comprehension, things that thrive in the deep, the dark, the desolate places, entities that exist in a state of being so alien that to glimpse them is to shatter the very foundations of your sanity. I live with the knowledge of what I saw, the silent hum a constant reminder, a phantom touch on my mind. I am forever marked, a pawn in a game I still don't understand, having broken a rule whose true purpose I can only guess at. If this story disturbed you, you need to subscribe. I have dozens more accounts like this, some even worse. New horror stories every week. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. You've been warned. Sometimes late at night, when the house settles into a profound silence, I feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turn slowly, deliberately, knowing there's nothing there, but compelled nonetheless. And for the briefest, most terrifying moment, I swear I can feel that same cold, probing gaze, a pressure from beyond, as if it's still out there, patiently watching, subtly influencing, waiting for another breach. In the crack, the faint fault line on my kitchen window sometimes seems to shimmer with an inner light, almost imperceptible, a reminder that sometimes the outside finds its way in.